I'm glad we can all fit in this. It does feel very cosy and small in here, but it seems like a really nice number of people. So once again, welcome to the Welsh Aesthetics Forum, generously supported by the British Society of Aesthetics. Please find a seat. As I've said before, the Welsh Aesthetics Forum, its current home is here at Cardiff, but we're hoping at some point when we have the time and energy to extend it across other Welsh universities. I'm very happy to welcome our second speaker of the academic year, Chris Early, from the University of Edinburgh. Chris is a Leverhulme Ali Career Fellow who works on issues in aesthetics, epistemology, and philosophy of history. He's also co-editor of the journal Debates in Aesthetics. You're still doing that, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, cool. And also he's a practicing artist himself and is a visiting tutor at the Slade School of Fine Art, which I find very impressive and intimidating. Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. Take it away.
Cool, great. Okay, thank you very much to Daisy and to the Welsh Aesthetics Forum for inviting me here today. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful mid-November Wednesday afternoon. I was expecting like 3 people, so thank you all so much for coming. So what I want to do in this talk is I want to try and engage with 2 big questions in contemporary philosophy of art. So the first is what I'll call the epistemic question, right? How can we learn about the world from our engagements with art? Many people have an intuition or a sense that they engage with artworks and artworks seem to improve their understanding of aspects of the world. They feel like they've gained some knowledge from it. They feel they've improved their epistemic standing. So philosophers, especially a specific set of philosophers within philosophy of art called aesthetic cognitivists, are really interested in trying to get to grips with this question. They're also really interested in a second question that I will call the aesthetic question. How does an artwork's aesthetic value bear on its epistemic value and vice versa, right? So artworks can realize all kinds of different values, just focusing on 2 values that they can realize. So you might be engaged with an artwork and think, wow, I've learned something from this artwork. And you might also engage with it and think, wow, this artwork's really beautiful or elegant or harmonious. And one question, or what this question is really trying to get at, is does the artwork's beauty in some way improve our ability to gain knowledge, or does it maybe get in the way of our ability to gain knowledge? And vice versa, does gaining knowledge or understanding about the world actually help us access the aesthetic value of an artwork? So here's the particular way I'm going to try to engage with these questions. So first, I'm going to try to present to you a particular way of approaching the epistemic question. So I want to propose that to learn from art, audiences often have to exercise high degrees of intellectual agency. I then want to propose that once we get these high degrees of intellectual agency into view, this opens up a wide range of different relationships between learning and aesthetic appreciation in the arts. I think philosophers of art only sometimes focus on one particular relation, but I want to suggest there's many. And then for the rest of the talk, I really want to focus on trying to make the case that art can reveal the aesthetic value of our own intellectual agency. And when I use our and we here, I'm talking about audiences. So I'm really talking about art from the audience's perspective. Okay, so to begin with the epistemic question. So what I want to begin by proposing is 2 ways to think about how we can approach this epistemic question. Now, I'm not here going to say anything detailed about what we learn from art. So sorry to disappoint you all. I'm just going to use the term insight as a generic placeholder term for whatever epistemic states we reach at the end of a process of inquiry. So that could be knowledge, could be understanding, could be wisdom, could be improved degrees of belief. Whatever you like, just chuck that in the term insight. What I really want to focus on here is how we go about gaining these insights. And as I say, I think there's 2 broad approaches we can take. So first, we can think about insight in art. So this begins with the idea that artworks are records of insights that have been achieved by artists. So an artist might have come to know something about the world or understand something about the world, and then they make some artwork, and the artwork they produce is a record of that particular achievement. It conveys this knowledge or this understanding that the artist has managed to realize to us. Now, often that process is a bit more complicated, right? The insights kind of come about during the process of making an artwork. But the idea here is that audiences learn from art by trying to figure out what the artist has achieved. So this, I think, this is a pretty standard and perhaps quite intuitive way to think about how it is that we learn from art. And I think this may cover many cases, right? I think artworks do have a lot to teach us in this particular way. However, philosophers of art have encountered all kinds of problems when really trying to get this view to have any kind of extensional adequacy, right? So artworks often seem to be very open-ended, and they don't seem to be in the business of just straightforwardly conveying propositions to us, giving us theories, giving us arguments, the kinds of things that philosophers have usually thought are the kinds of things we use to convey insights, right? And so this has led philosophers of art to suggest there's another way in which we might learn from art, that we might be able to still learn from these very open-ended artworks where there don't seem to really be any clear insights in the artwork to grasp. And I'm going to call this insight through art. So this begins with a slightly different idea. Artists make artworks that present audiences with open-ended prompts that invite them, the audiences, to inquire into a topic in a certain way, right? So here, the artwork is open-ended. It is inviting us to look at a particular topic, right? Perhaps, I don't know, if it's this particular painting here, it could be the topic of scientific experimentation, or it could be the topic of learning itself, something like that. But it doesn't actually give us a claim about the nature of learning or the nature of scientific experimentation. Instead, it might prompt us to think about it. So what do I mean by prompt? Well, there's all kinds of things we could think about here. So artworks are often thought to pose questions, right? They give us a question, or perhaps they present a hypothesis, right? They say maybe things are this way, but this needs to be tested. They sometimes present us with ambiguities, and philosophers of art have thought, actually, we can learn quite a lot from being confronted with an ambiguity. They might emphasize things. So this is quite a popular view within philosophy of art, that artworks exemplify things to us. An exemplification roughly means they point to properties that they instantiate. So they show us a particular shade of red, a particular emotion, something like that. They draw it to our attention. Or artworks might connect things. They might show us patterns. They might show us how different things can be put in the same category, things like this. Now, on some views, a question, a hypothesis, an ambiguity, just noticing something doesn't bring a process of inquiry to a close, right? We might want to gain some positive view of some aspect of the world. These are still kind of open-ended as to what actual insight we're going to get to. And so this has led some philosophers of art to think that to arrive at insight, audiences have to take some additional steps for themselves. We're presented with these prompts, and it falls to the audience to answer the question, test the hypothesis, think through the ambiguity, or try to work out what the epistemic consequences are of noticing something or of paying attention to something, right? So the artwork is giving us something, it's giving us some kind of indication of where to go, but we as audiences are having to step in and do some thinking for ourselves, take a couple more steps down the path of inquiry to actually get to knowledge or understanding. So we have these two different views of learning from art, and what I really want to stress is that there's a different kind of intellectual agency involved in these two. So there's intellectual agency shown by audiences in both cases, right? It can be hard to work out what insights an artist has realized. You have to do a lot of interpretative work. But when we're engaging in insight in art, our intellectual agency, I think, is directed at working out what the artist has achieved. When we're engaged in insight through art, we're directing our intellectual agency to try to help achieve an insight. Another way to think about this is that we're co-producing or perhaps collaborating with an artist on a project of inquiry, and that we can perhaps share the credit between ourselves. The artist has done something, we as audiences have added something else on. We've both worked together to realise an insight. Okay, so these are two different ways in which we can think about how we gain insight from our engagements with art. So I think this leads us to some interesting ways to answer the aesthetic question. And to try to get there, I want to introduce another distinction that's recently been made within the aesthetics literature. And this time this is a distinction between two ways in which we might be able to grasp the aesthetic value of an artwork. And this distinction comes from T. Nguyen, and he suggests that we can think about two different ways in which we can appreciate the aesthetic value of an artwork. So the first is what he calls object appreciation. So here, audiences appreciate aesthetic properties with which an artist has imbued their work. So the story might start to sound a bit familiar. Artists are working away in their studio and they try to give their artwork certain aesthetic properties, a certain gracefulness, a certain harmony, a certain strikingness, garishness, something like this. And when we as audiences come along to appreciate the work aesthetically, we try to work out what aesthetic properties the artist has given that work, right? We're looking at the object in front of us, not ourselves, something like that. Now, Nguyen has, I think, quite rightly observed that within aesthetics, this has kind of been the default view. This has been the default assumption of how aesthetic appreciation happens. But Nguyen has proposed that there's a second way in which we can go about engaging with the aesthetic properties of artworks. And he calls this process aesthetic appreciation. So here, audiences appreciate the aesthetic properties of actions that the artwork invites them to perform. And Nguyen thinks that there's whole categories of artworks out there that really seem to be more interested in getting us to engage in process aesthetic appreciation than getting us to just appreciate them as objects. So here's Nguyen's kind of centerpiece example, games. So I'm just going to assume for the sake of this presentation that games are artworks. Some people think they're not. I'm not going to try and get into that issue here. So how do we aesthetically appreciate games? Well, I'll just think about, oh, hello. What are you doing here?
Sorry, what did I do?
You closed the door and the computer was like, I'm confused about that. Okay, so I'll just use board games as the example. You could appreciate Monopoly, something like that, by looking at all the pieces and looking at the little dog and the little car and looking at how the board's been designed and the beautiful colours that are out there and the artwork that's on the cards and the perhaps like kind of funny way that the text on the cards is written. And if you were to do that, you would be appreciating the artwork in this sort of object-oriented way. You would be appreciating the aesthetic properties that the game designer has managed to imbue it with. But Nguyen thinks that's not really appreciating a game in the unique way that games call to us to appreciate them. He thinks we have to aesthetically appreciate games by playing them. And here we engage with a different thing that the game designer has intentionally designed for us. So he observes that game designers set certain goals, right, the victory conditions of the game, what it takes to win it, and constraints about how we should pursue those goals. If you're running a marathon, the goal is to try to get the fastest time and cross the finish line. But you can't just like climb over the barriers or, I don't know, drive an F1 car. You have to do it on your own 2 feet following the course, right? So you are pursuing a goal in a specifically constrained way. Now, what Nguyen proposes is that what game designers are designing are agencies for their players to occupy, right? By playing a game, you've been given a certain set of ends and a certain set of abilities to pursue those ends. What Nguyen thinks is that we have designed agencies that we step into when we're playing a game. to act to try to get certain things. And then what Nguyen wants to also propose is that by getting us to occupy certain agencies, often, and I'll come back to this point, agencies that we wouldn't normally occupy in everyday life, games can bring out the aesthetic properties of our own actions. So we might feel a particular move that we play in a game to be graceful, a particular strategy that we formulate to be particularly daring or striking, a certain set of moves to have a harmonious relationship to each other. The game designer has put some constraints in place to allow us to do these things, but they haven't given us a script, right? We have had to make certain choices as players in a game about how we're going to act within this space of ends and means that game designers have given us. So what is the focus of our aesthetic appreciation? Not necessarily this designed object over here, but our own agency within the game. Okay, so I think there is a clear resonance between this distinction that I've been drawing between insight in art and insight through art, and this distinction that Nguyen draws between object aesthetics and process aesthetics. And I think by combining these two, we open up a pretty rich possibility space of different ways to understand the relationship between pursuing insight and aesthetic appreciation. And I've put this together in the following table. And throughout my life, I've always wanted to be a philosopher who made tables like this, and I've never managed to do it. And then finally I was like, wow, this calls for a table. I don't know if it's a good table, but I'm very proud of myself. So, here is the possibility space. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that any of these statements are true. These are ways in which you could try to say that aesthetic qualities bear upon aesthetic properties. It might be the case that they don't at all, but here's just a possibility space for trying to put forward some positive or perhaps negative views. So first, we can talk about insight in art and object aesthetics. So it would go something like this: by grasping the aesthetic qualities with which an artist has imbued their work, an audience grasps what insights the artist has achieved, and vice versa. Right? So here, we're trying to work out what the artist has done. That's the point of appreciation. And we're trying to work out how the aesthetic properties they've given their work help us to grasp the insights that they have realized, and vice versa. Perhaps we grasp what insights the artist has realized, and that helps us to grasp what aesthetic properties it has. Now, I'm not yet saying how we go about that or whether we can even go about that, but this is a possibility opened up by this view. Now, I think by and large, this has been the option that philosophers of art have really focused on. And I think that's mainly because insight through art, the emphasis on audience agency hasn't always been brought out. And also process aesthetics just hasn't really been brought into the repertoire of aesthetic cognitivism. But we can now see there's some other possibilities, right? So you could try to search for insight in art, but find that the artwork encourages you to engage in some process. So it would look like this: by grasping the aesthetic qualities of a process the artist invites the audience to participate in, the audience grasps what insight the artist has achieved, right? So we have to participate in some kind of process that has interesting aesthetic qualities, and by experiencing those qualities, somehow that directs us to realize what the artist has achieved. So here you could think about this. I mean, I was trying to think of like what an example of this would be, and I think it's artworks that feel like they're puzzles. So if you think about a puzzle, it has a set solution, and you can either get that solution right or wrong, but the setter doesn't just tell you what the solution is. They give you a puzzle, and you have to try to use your own intellectual capacities to try to work your way through that puzzle. And by doing that, you may experience all kinds of interesting aesthetic textures of your own agency as you feel yourself connecting bits of your background knowledge, as you feel yourself seeing patterns in the puzzle. But what you're trying to do ultimately is work out what the solution is that the setter has put, has made the goal of this puzzle. So moving this to the art case, think about artworks that might contain some piece of knowledge, but are really ambiguous or confusing or elliptical. So like really complex poetry, really difficult films. You have to engage in a lot of interpretive labor as an audience member. You have to go beyond what the artwork is actually handing you. That might raise all kinds of interesting aesthetic experiences of your own agency as you're trying to interpret this. And perhaps, and again, not arguing for this is just a possibility that the aesthetic cognitivist could try to run with, perhaps there may be certain aesthetic experiences of our own agency that serve as like indicators that we're on the road to grasping the insight that the artist has realized. Maybe that is the case, maybe not. But this is a way that we can combine insight in art and process aesthetics. We can also think about combining insight through art and object aesthetics. So this would look something like this. By grasping the aesthetic qualities with which the artist has imbued their work, an audience is invited to engage in further inquiry. Now, there is actually somebody who's attempted to argue for something like this, and this is Elizabeth Schellekens. I think she's a really key voice in this aesthetic cognitivist debate. She's at the University of Uppsala. And she uses this example of David's The Death of Socrates. And she argues that by engaging with features of this artwork that are usually in traditional aesthetic theories taken to be the focus of aesthetic engagement, things like its extraordinary visual perspective, stunning contrasts of light, vibrant palette of colours and tonalities, clarity of line, vigorous movement, so on and so forth, she thinks that by engaging with these features of the artwork, we don't come to grasp some specific insight about what Socrates' death meant, or something like that. What Socrates was trying to finally convey to us about the world in this particular moment. Rather, she proposes these features of the artwork act as what I've called prompts. They get us to engage in a kind of explorative thought process which engages us in a set of contemplations, observations and considerations which, although not directly aimed at acquiring knowledge, often leads to an enhanced understanding, right? So put another way, they get us to engage in inquiring. They get us to begin to explore the topics that the artwork addresses. But here, it's the audience who's having to do the exploration. They're having to take some steps for themselves, right? So again, we have the aesthetic qualities, right? These visual, formal, affective features of the work, prompting a certain kind of autonomous inquiring in their audiences. And then finally, we have the very last bit of this quadrant, where we're bringing together insight through art and process aesthetics. So, by being invited by an artist to engage in an autonomous inquiring, the audience grasps aesthetic qualities of their own cognitive agency, right? So you have an artwork, it provides you with all these prompts, it poses weird questions, gets you to notice certain things. You begin inquiring, using these questions, noticing these things and trying to factor that into your inquiry. And as you do that, you start to appreciate aesthetic qualities of your own acts of inquiring. Now, it's this option that I really want to focus on for the rest of this talk, because I don't think it's been discussed very much within the relevant literature. And I want to try and make some sense of it. Now, before going on, just two quick points. Firstly, one and the same artwork might get us to, at some points, engage in insight in art, right? It might just have bits of knowledge to convey to us. And then at other points, engage us in insight through art. Think of like a big complex novel. There's facts you can learn from it, but there's also there's bigger things and more open-ended bits of the novel that might get you to inquire in different ways. Nguyen also argues that one and the same artwork might get us to engage in object appreciation and process appreciation. So again, you could, look, there's many beautifully designed board games out there. Video games that have wonderful narratives that you can engage with, but that also require you to play them at other points. The cutscene plays and then you actually have to get into the level and do something, right? So one and the same artwork can be appreciated both in this object and process-oriented way. What this leads me to think is that artworks might, because artworks are complex and address us in all kinds of different ways, one and the same artwork may get us to engage with it in multiple different ways. And there's a bit of a question as to whether there's like one way in which it's best to engage with an artwork, or whether we can engage with them in different ways at different points, or whether these all have to come together into some sort of consistent message or something like that. I'm not quite sure what to think about this, but I'm inclined to view this as a set of possibilities that one and the same artwork might be able to activate different possibilities at the same time. But put that to the side. Let's focus on this bit down here. So I've already given you a bit of a story about how it is that artists might be able to encourage us to engage in autonomous inquiry. It's by giving us these open-ended prompts that get us to address topics in a certain way. Now, I think I need to say something about how it might be possible to grasp aesthetic qualities of cognitive agency. And here's how I'm going to try to approach this. So first, just a couple more points about inquiring. So on some just views, here's a basic picture of inquiry. Inquiry begins with some kind of intellectual confusion or curiosity, and then attempts to arrive at insights that solve the confusion or satisfy the curiosity, right? So John Dewey, one of, I think, the big philosophers of inquiry, thinks about what exactly inquiry is. Now, to move from confusion to curiosity, to actually go through this process, the inquirer has to perform many different actions. So this could involve, we've already seen some of these, formulating questions, right? That's often thought to be a first step in inquiry. You've got this confusion. To get it under control, you try to pose a question to work out what exactly is it that's confusing you, and that can direct you where to go next. Then you might need to formulate some hypotheses that give you explanations of this confusing phenomenon. Maybe you have to design experiments, collect and analyze data or information. You have to maybe draw connections between pieces of information that you already know, but that you haven't connected up yet, that might help you to deal with this, so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of activities that we perform whilst inquiring, and if any of you have, I'm sure everyone in this room has had a go at writing a philosophy paper. Maybe you've gone through some of these actions. It feels pretty effortful. So I'm going to call these moves in inquiry, right? That's just the generic term I'm going to use for this complex set of actions that we perform. So it seems like we often use characteristically aesthetic language to describe these actions. So you might say to somebody or think to yourself, wow, I'm drawing a really striking inference suddenly. Or maybe I'm drawing a really dull inference. Oh, that's not really where I wanted to go. That's not what I was hoping. You might formulate a surprising question, right? As this question is coming into your mind, it seems striking to you or unusual. You might arrive at a harmonious conclusion where you go, wow, I can see all my commitments falling into place and connecting with each other. Or it might be really awkward where you're like, oh, I've kind of got to the end of inquiry too soon or something like that. I don't know. So it seems like it's not strange to think about describing moves of inquiry in aesthetic terms, but you might say, okay, fine, we use aesthetic language, but what really makes these assessments aesthetic, right? What actually makes these particular terms or these particular assessments, what makes them fall in the realm of aesthetics? Why not just think these are not just epistemic judgments, where we're using aesthetic terms just in a metaphorical way to suggest like we've stepped closer towards our epistemic goals? Well, I want to give a suggestion of how I think this we might answer this question. And here, it's great that I've come to Cardiff because I'm drawing upon the work of a Cardiff-based philosopher. Unfortunately, that philosopher is not here today, which is both sad because I can't double check all of this, but it's also great because I don't have to look into Panos Paris's eyes as I try to say something about his own view back to him. So, it's a mixed bag. Okay, so Panos Paris proposes that one really central feature of the aesthetic is form. There might be more. There might be others, and Panos in his work has explored some others, but he really focuses on form. And I think this is a good place to begin to understand why appreciating moves of inquiry might have an aesthetic quality to it in a deeper way than just saying, look at all these aesthetic properties we assign to things. Now, I do want to also say, and this is my apology for aestheticians, like, we still haven't answered the question of what makes something aesthetic. We are working on it though. So we're trying to get there. But form is historically, canonically, something we can refer to. So I think Panos has a particularly interesting way of trying to make sense of what the historical tradition might mean by form. And he says it's the ensemble of an object's experienceable elements, right? So the first thing that Panos observes is when we're talking about form, we're talking about the way that different parts of an object relate to each other, right? And he thinks this comes about in some of the terms we use. We talk about harmonious relations, striking things that we see in an object. Well, Panos thinks that these terms imply some kind of relation between two things, right? We are judging how, at least two things, we're judging how different parts of an object come together in a structure or as some kind of a whole. So that's why I put in brackets interrelations, just to really stress that point. We're interested in how things relate to each other. Also, Panos thinks what we're focusing on here is an object's experienceable elements. Now here, Panos is using that term experienceable to try to break away from certain tradition in aesthetics, where the distinctly aesthetic features of an object are those that are perceptible, right? What we can see, touch, smell, taste, these kinds of things. What Panos wants to try to do is move away from that, because that doesn't seem, if we take a really strictly perceptual view of the aesthetic, we lose all kinds of things that we seem to engage in aesthetic appreciation of, like novels, for instance. Yes, you can just appreciate what the words look like on the page or the smell of the paper, but we don't seem to just be appreciating something that is purely perceptible. You can also think about scientific formula and theories, mathematical formula and theories. They are often the objects of aesthetic appreciation, but we're not just appreciating like the shape of the E and the M and the C and the squared and things like that. So Panos shifts to experienceable. And this allows him to take in not just the perceptual features of objects, but also cognitive experiences that we have in relation to that object, the experience of agency that we, agential acts that we engage in when using that particular object or just appreciating it in certain ways. And I think this opens up the door to bring inquiring into the fold of the aesthetic. So here's how I want to try to apply this notion of form to inquiring. So we come to inquiry with all kinds of commitments in place. I just take that to be, pretty a pretty obvious view. We don't come as complete blank slates. Some of us might have more commitments that are relevant to the thing we're inquiring into. If you're an expert, you might have loads of relevant commitments about the thing you're trying to find out about. If you're a novice, you might not have very many relevant commitments, but you have some commitments in place already, which you begin to try to marshal to try to grasp what's going on here. And I think that through our moves at inquiry, we create new interrelations between our commitments. So our commitments often bear upon each other. You can use that metaphor of there's a web of beliefs, they cohere with each other in different ways. And as we inquire, we try to put our commitments into new relations with each other. So we can do this in two ways. One might be adding new commitments, right? We find we're having a problem understanding something because there's some gap in our network of commitments, and we need to fill that gap. So we need to acquire some new belief that might help us make more coherent sense of the other commitments we endorse. But it could also involve, I think, reconfiguring our standing commitments. So there may be processes of inquiry that don't actually reveal any new knowledge to us, but just get us to perhaps see new connections between our commitments, see new ways of categorizing our commitments together, something like this. Okay, so here's my proposal. Through moves in inquiry, we change the form of our cognitive standing on a topic, right? We, through our acts, through these intellectual acts, are bringing about emergent formal relations between our commitments. And I think that might be what makes appreciation of our act of inquiring aesthetic, right? We're seeing these new formal relations that open up between different beliefs we have, or maybe different suppositions or things like that. I'm putting a lot into the category of commitments here. But what this involves, and this is another point that I'm drawing from Panos, is that we're not focusing here on what insight we achieve through inquiry. We're focusing on how the relations between our commitments are changing during the process of inquiry. So I think this might mean it's possible to engage in aesthetic appreciation of processes of inquiry that haven't come to a close yet. And in fact, that might be the point where we have these aesthetic reactions as we are in the process of inquiring. It might also allow us to aesthetically appreciate moves in inquiry in processes of inquiry that don't actually lead to insight. And I'll say a bit more about that, hopefully if I have some time, at the end, right? But I think this is a way to begin to bring inquiring into the fold of the aesthetic, right? All those aesthetic terms we were using, I want to propose what we're trying to respond to are these new formal relations that open up between our commitments, that they are striking, harmonious, awkward, dull, things like this. Okay, now this account, I also just want to say, applies to art. So when we're applying it to art, what I want to say is artworks give us prompts which get us to act in certain ways, and through doing that, we can have these aesthetic experiences of our acts of inquiring. But hopefully, you know, if you're not an artist and you don't engage with art very much, hopefully you felt something like this when engaging with philosophy, with science, maybe just when searching for your keys in the house, something like that. We can have these moments where we go, oh wow, that was a graceful way of thinking, or I'm feeling the well-formedness of a question as it's coming into my mind. Okay, so to bring this presentation to a bit of a conclusion, I want to just look at some questions that can be raised for this account of the aesthetics of inquiring and its role in art appreciation. So here's the first question. So we might want to ask a very foundational question. What is the point of art appreciation, right? I want to suggest that the aesthetics of inquiring, right, engaging aesthetically with your own cognitive agency, has some important part to play in appreciating art. I mean, I think what I'm describing is something I get really excited about when I engage with art, when I think of the experiences of art that have really excited me, that stick with me. I go back to certain artworks because they set my mind on fire in a certain way, and they make me explore the world and feel my own cognitive agency in interesting ways. But one might say, well, isn't the point of art appreciation understanding and evaluating artworks? You might think, looking at everything I've just said, that I might just be suggesting that audiences appreciate themselves, right? You're engaged with an artwork, but what you're focusing on here is your own cognitive agency. You kind of become a bit like Narcissus over here. You're just like focusing on yourself, and this, you have to say this kind of with tears in your eyes and rending your garments. What about the artworks, right? What are they doing here? Are they just receding into the background and we're just reflecting on art, the amazing things that we can do? Now, notice I don't think this question comes up for these other three ways of engaging and appreciating an artwork, because here we're still trying to grasp some kind of achievement that the artwork has brought about independent of the of us audiences. But down here, it looks like we're suddenly like just going, hey, there's the artwork, nice prompt. Now, what about me? So, I think we might be able to push back against this. And again, it's worth reflecting on games, because I think they might have some clues to give us. So, as we've already seen, game designers design constraints which allow audiences to try out new agencies. And when we play games, some games, not all games, but often when we play games, we can be surprised by the acts we're performing. So you might, like, in everyday life, be a really safe driver, and then you go home and play some racing game where you're a complete speed demon, ignoring the rules. You might be somebody who is very, economically conservative and timid, and then you go play like a cutthroat economic board game where you're pushing everyone into terrible deals and undercutting the market and dumping companies on people, right? So games can get us to occupy agencies that can be surprising to us, that we don't normally occupy. Now, what I want to propose is this surprise, this sense that we have that suddenly we're doing something new for us. This isn't the normal way we act, can motivate attention to these aesthetic properties of our agency in the game, right? The surprise gives us a reason to reflect upon what we're doing. We're doing something new and strange. That can get us to pause, to stop a moment, to reflect on what we're doing. And what I think this reflection reveals to us is that we are experiencing aesthetics of agency, but these are aesthetics of agency which are hard to bring about and reflect upon on our own, right? I think that shock also partially involves the sense that we don't normally act in this way. We have engaged with an artifact that is getting us to act in a new way. Now, the artifact is not scripting how we're going to act. It's still allowing us some space to act creatively, to do things for ourselves. But I think still what's going on here is we can ask a kind of a question. If we had not encountered this designed artifact, this artifact that's been put together by someone else, by an artist, the game designer, would we be able to have these experiences of our own agency that are not totally scripted by the game designer, but still aren't brought about entirely by ourselves? Applying this to the art case, can maybe get something like this. Artists design prompts that aim at particular topics, which encourage us to inquire in certain ways. Now, artworks are much less restrictive than games. I don't think artworks really have victory conditions. They're more sort of like inquire into this topic and try to make some epistemic progress on it, but there's not a specific insight you might have to get to, something like that. So, artists often present us with really unusual prompts that get us to inquire in surprising ways, right? An artwork might pose a really unusual question, draw your attention to something that you don't normally focus on, give you a wild hypothesis about the world where you're like, no, I've got to test that, I've got to see it, that can't be right, something like that. And in doing this, imposing these unusual prompts to us, artists can get us to experience and attend to aesthetic textures of our own epistemic agency, which again, might be hard to bring about on our own, right? So we are, in some sense, relying on the artist to help us act in ways that might be really difficult to do on our own. But again, the artist is not fully scripting what we're doing here. This is all to say, I don't think we're just leaving the artwork behind here, right? I think we often have a sense, I think it's the surprise element that brings this out to us in sort of phenomenological way, that we are doing something that we haven't just completely brought about on our own. Somebody has helped us to do this. Somebody has motivated us, has given us some constraints on our activity that have allowed us to act in certain ways, right? And I think that's why we might praise artists still for helping us engage in these open-ended inquiries and gain these aesthetic experiences, right? We don't just praise ourselves, usually. We do still praise artists. I think it's this sense that they're helping us do something which we just can't do on our own. Okay, one last question, which I will just very briefly touch on. So I've said that insight in art can lead us to these interesting aesthetic experiences. But you might wonder, okay, can we go the opposite direction, right? Can we have these aesthetic experiences of our own cognitive agency, epistemic agency? I've been using the terms interchangeably throughout. If we have these sort of aesthetic experiences of feeling the harmony between different ideas, feeling something being really striking, does that suggest we're on the path to epistemic improvement, right? Do positive epistemic properties and values suggest we are on our way to truth? Well, I think this is you know, I've got a moderate answer to this. Let's say it that way. So here's a really optimistic answer. Beautiful inquiring is going to be the indicator that we're on the road to truth. This is, I think, what aesthetic cognitivists would love to be the case. It's actually what, if you look at, you know, some writings by scientists and mathematicians, it's quite popular for mathematicians to say, well, the beauty of a proof is a reason to endorse that particular proof or that particular theory, right? There's some connection between beauty, between harmony, between elegance, and whatever the goals we're trying to reach in science or maths. The problem with this is that it just doesn't seem very well founded. So there's many cases in which beauty and truth come apart. So that's Tycho Brahe, and many people have said, his view of the cosmos is beautiful. It's beautifully put together. Unfortunately, it's false, but it's aesthetically compelling, right? And you can think there's many other examples from the history of science and the history of maths, and there's of course lots of examples from the history of art. I think this is also something that happens in conspiracy theories, which is another topic that I'm working on at the moment. I think conspiracy theories are often quite beautiful and formally beautiful. That beauty, though, doesn't always connect up with the truth. Okay, so what might be a more moderate answer? I'm not going to talk about Kant, and I'm not going to talk about Angela Breitenbach, but I am basing what I'm going to say off what they're talking about. Here's what I want to propose. Here's a more modest way of going. So paying attention to the aesthetic qualities of our own acts of inquiring can help us acknowledge that we're inquiring in an intellectually autonomous way, right? So you notice, oh, wow, these thoughts are striking, they're harmonious, and I've brought this about. Right, I'm appreciating my own actions. I'm not appreciating something about the artwork. It's not something somebody else has. I'm not appreciating somebody else's acts of inquiry. These are my acts of inquiry, right? So the aesthetic qualities are just something that can draw our attention in the ways that I've mentioned before. By drawing our attention to these aesthetic qualities of inquiry, artworks can motivate us to engage in intellectually autonomous inquiry, right? So I think there's a close connection between experiencing the aesthetic qualities of inquiring and being disposed to try to inquire in autonomous ways, right? To not just defer to others in inquiry. Now, of course, intellectual autonomy, inquiring in an autonomous way, though we like to really think of it as being a really important thing to do, can often lead us astray. Again, think of conspiracy theorists doing their own research, not relying on experts. So just inquiring autonomously doesn't always lead you to truth. But it's been argued that still trying to exhibit some autonomy, to inquire for yourself, to try to work a problem through in your own mind, to try to do all these kinds of things are still really important for us as intellectual agents. It's important for us to try to train our reasoning abilities. It's important for us to try to explore the possibility space that a particular inquiry is taking place in. And gaining these reasoning abilities, engaging in this exploration is easier to do if we act on our own rather than just relying on information provided by others. That's what I want to propose. So perhaps it's this that engaging with the aesthetic qualities of inquiring might gives us this access to this important part of our cognitive lives and our cognitive standing in the world, even if we don't arrive at truth. There seems to be something important about engaging with that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. We're going to have a 2-minute